Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is for you guys. We're going to delve into topics 5.3 and 5.4 from the College Board's ED for AP Environmental Science, looking specifically at what's called the Green Revolution and some impacts of agriculture, right? Enduring understandings remain with these two primaries right here. When humans use resources, they alter natural systems. Definitely true with agriculture. But two, humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use. The reading to accompany this particular notes section is section 12.3, pages 348 through 355 from the Miller textbook Exploring Environmental Science for AP. Now, before we get too much into the weeds, no pun intended, of agriculture, Um, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of agriculture. Um, so, first of all, what has modern agriculture allowed us to do? Well, one, it's allowed us to settle in one place. So, before the onset of agriculture, right, before humans figured out that we could put seeds in the ground and cultivate food, right, we were hunter-gatherers. We had to rely on what nature provided, right, and then follow nature. So we were nomadic in a lot of cases. So we had to change locations based on the season and maybe when herds that we might rely on for hunting purposes moved, we moved with them. All right. But when we discovered that we can put seeds in the ground and grow food, that allowed us to actually begin to make settlements, permanent settlements. All right. It also allowed us to grow surplus food, and that's an important thing for several reasons, right? So because we could grow surplus food, right, we could then not have to rely on each person to be a food producer. All right. So if I'm a farmer and I grow far more food than what I need to survive, right, that allows me to produce excess food that other people could buy from me, and then they can specialize. They could become an artisan of some sort, blacksmith or something like that, right? They could become artists or scholars. Okay. And because we settled in one place, this allowed us to begin collecting possessions and building more permanent structures and homes. All right. Uh, so because not everybody had to be in charge of getting food and surviving, we could devote more time to education and to technology, and then we see the beginnings of civilization begin to form. All right. Um, so agriculture is super important, right? And our modern way of life relies heavily on it. And it's also worth pointing out that there are not enough animals that exist in nature for us to hunt and eat, right, for our food. And likewise with edible foods, right? We need to alter systems for the purpose of creating food, right? To feed the population that we have and certainly the population that we're going to have in the future. The idea is how can we do that that minimizes our major impacts of agriculture, right? So with agriculture, because we are altering natural systems, we're destroying habitats. Okay, uh, we have to irrigate pretty intensively, so there's a lot of local water use that goes into it. There's air pollution from the machinery. All right, and productions fertilizers. There's water pollution. So we not only do we alter those systems, but we insert fertilizers and pesticides that can run off into local waterways and pollute them. And then as we till that soil, right, we're loosening it and it's more prone to soil erosion. So these are major impacts of agriculture, right? So can we do agriculture in a way that minimizes these, right? We're not going to get away from agriculture. All right. So now we have to also understand that, an industrialized system with heavy, heavy input. So this type of agriculture with a single type of crop, that's not nature, by the way. Okay. You'll actually find more biodiversity on a city block than you will in this heavily industrialized agricultural field right here. Okay, but that system is different than a system like this. So this is an example of a more sustainable farm where they're growing multiple different types and relying on human power more so. Probably not spraying with pesticides frequently. It's covered to minimize evaporation loss and stuff like that. That is a different system than an industrialized farm, but neither of those systems are nature. Neither of them are the actual original habitat in these areas, right? So the idea of what we're going to aim for near the end of this unit of sustainable agriculture is how can we produce food in a way that minimizes those impacts that we talked about before. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about principal types of agriculture. All right. And we'll get to the livestock question later on, actually. So, first of all, how do we do agriculture in the U.S.? Primarily, it is through this process called industrialized agriculture, right? So it's going to be high input, which leads to very high output, right? So we invest heavily in machines and seed and water and agrochemicals, right? And fertilizers, right? But that's the high input side. But as a result, we get extremely high yield. So lots and lots of food per acre comes out as a result of industrialized agriculture. Okay. Now, that in mind, um, there are obviously some downsides to these principal types. Okay, to industrialized agriculture. Now, contrast that with what's called subsistence agriculture. And we did discuss this in an earlier unit, but let's readdress what this means. So, subsistence agriculture is a more traditional approach where basically people farm to produce food for themselves. So, this is not a large industrialized practice where they're growing tons and tons of food to sell on the open market for a profit. This is mainly people trying to survive off the land using agriculture. Okay. Um, So there's what's called shifting cultivation or slash and burn agriculture, a big cause, primary cause of uh, tropical loss, right? So in our tropical rainforest, that slash and burn agriculture, right, is a primary cause of the loss of tropical rainforests. All right. There's nomadic herding, which basically you herd livestock, but then move them around based on availability of grass and with the seasons. All right. Intercropping. So intercropping, by the way, is growing more than one type of crop on one plot of land, which is a much more sustainable thing to do than the monocultures that is typical with industrialized agriculture. All right. But keeping in mind that agriculture is agriculture, and regardless of how we're doing it, we are altering natural systems. Some are more closely mimicking nature than others, though. All right. Um, Now, we're going to start with the Green Revolution here and understanding what has happened throughout history to allow food production to keep pace with population growth. All right. So the Green Revolution, by the way, is not uh, part of the environmental movement. You know, so when they're talking about Green Revolution here, they're not talking about a bunch of protesting hippies. All right. This is referring specifically to advances in agricultural practices. All right. So if we take a look at the production of wheat over time, so between 1860 and 1940, not much change. From 1940 onward, look at this curve and that growth. Now we can look at a similar curve with wheat, or sorry, with rice, all right, where we got an upward curve, and then also with corn, right? Now, these three graphs basically paint the same picture. Something happened right in here, all right, and then again later on that led to huge, dramatic increases in our ability to produce certain food crops. All right. And that's what we're talking about when we say the Green Revolution. We're talking about the transformation of agriculture that began around 1945. Right. Much of it is attributed to a gentleman named Norman Borlaug, who basically developed miracle wheat. Basically, through hybridization practices, was able to increase wheat yield by a factor of like more than three. So one of the things I do want you guys to understand when we say yield, we're talking about amount of food like per acre. So basically, same amount of land, but three times as much food produced on that same amount of land, right? Uh, he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for essentially helping to prevent the starvation of upwards of 1 billion people. Okay, um, so the Green Revolution is referring to this big transformation in agriculture that caused these rapid increases in our ability to grow certain food crops. All right. Um, so what has been involved in that we'll talk about here. So the Green Revolution. A couple important things to understand. It's only really benefited industrial farmers, right? Because many of the practices in or advancements in agriculture have basically been forced us to go that really high input side of things. Okay, so lots of small farmers didn't necessarily benefit. Two, it's really only been applied to certain like food staples. So lots like rice, wheat, and corn would be the biggest. All right, and so many of the traditional foods grown in Africa have not benefited quite so much, right? Um, and also recognizing that yes, we can grow more food, but that also increases demand for fresh water, increased demand for agrochemicals like fertilizers and pesticides. All right. So growing more food, good. Being able to produce more food on a single acre, also good because that also helps limit the amount of expansion of agricultural land, right? But it has come with some caveats as listed on this slide. All right, moving forward. Phase one of the Green Revolution really just took place from about 1950 to 1970 and was based on this idea of industrialized agriculture. So again, it's really high input. So use of petroleum products, right? Pesticides and inorganic fertilizers. So basically, we could help prevent to a large degree, loss of crops from pests, right? Through better ability to produce fertilizer, we didn't have to worry so much about mineral nutrient depletion in our soils, right? Through the heavy use of machinery, right? And the engineering that goes into things like combines and tilling practices, right? All these things led to us being able to produce more, uh, cultivate more land more quickly, right? And have a more reliable yield from year to year because of pesticides and fertilizers, right? So that's phase one. Now, phase two involves selective breeding. So we got much better at taking the variation from within a particular species of plant and choosing the variations that we like in order to produce more plants like that. And that's really what Norman Borlaug did, by the way. So what they could do was, this is a rice plant, for example. You could take a rice plant, right? Now, amongst the varieties of rice, there's a lot of different variations in how much rice is produced per plant, for example. All right, and that the shorter plants are actually less prone to getting knocked over and dying because of wind and stuff like that. So through selective breeding, we're able to pick the particular genetic traits that we like and produce plants that have a much higher per plant yield and are less prone to um, the weather, are getting knocked down or dying off because of weather events. All right, so that's phase two is the selective breeding. Now, phase three, and we're probably just scratching the surface of what's possible right now, involves actual genetic manipulation. So we're not talking about the selective breeding where we're choosing a trait we like and then breeding more plants like that. We're talking about actually getting into the DNA of an organism and putting a trait into the DNA that we want, right? So bioengineers design particular genes into food crops in an effort to make them higher yielding, taste better, easier to transport, more drought resistant, more pest resistant. So, for example, you could breed a tomato plant uh, and insert a gene into the DNA of that tomato that causes it to produce its own Bt toxin. So, I believe it's a species of bacteria that produces like a toxin on its own, right? So if you can have the plant produce its own Bt toxin, that makes it so that you don't have to spray it with pesticides. So it can be more pest resistant. We can breed plants that can grow with less water, causing less strain on local water sources, or we can grow them in places without very much water, right? We can make them less prone to spoilage, so they can be transported longer or stored for longer periods of time. We can make them taste better, right? And also higher yielding and probably make them more nutritious. So um, in the case of vitamin E rice, right? So they insert a gene into that rice plant that causes it to actually produce vitamin E, right? And vitamin E is essential for the health of eyes and eyesight. And so in locations around the world where they have a heavy rice diet, uh, but perhaps not enough variety in their food, they can actually prevent like childhood onset of blindness just through by inserting this gene into the rice so that when the rice grows, it produces its own vitamin E, right? There's all kinds of potential with this genetic manipulation. It is a little bit controversial, and that is something we will talk about in more detail later. But I do want you guys to understand that selective breeding, while it does alter the genetic makeup of a variety, it's taking genes that are already a part of that species, right, and just selecting those genes to become more frequent. Genetically modifying, or GMOs, is actually taking genes from a different organism and inserting them into the organism we want, right? And a rather really important thing that we cannot do yet is we cannot create genes, right? We have to take from the genetic uh, or the gene pool of nature. So a gene that might exist in one organism that's unrelated could theoretically be spliced into the DNA of another organism. That's where we are right now. We cannot yet create our own gene that we want and insert it. It has to come from some other gene pool. All right. Um, so those are the three phases of the Green Revolution, and I'm going to end us right there.